So today we're talking about an odd one, right? The Legend of Zelda is an odd franchise, but this is a super odd game, Zelda 2. Forgoing everything that the original game gave, this one decided to take a new approach, and it actually got panned for it in the modern day. I don't know how people felt about it back then, but I know that this was kind of the black sheep of the gaming era, kind of like Mario 2 and so on and so forth. With that being said, is this game even worth your time? Is it even good? Well, let's find out. Alright, so it's time to buckle up because this one's a long one because Zelda 2 decided to get ambitious. With that being said, the game is a direct sequel to the first Zelda game, where now Link is older. He's 16. Link did this all as a child in the first game. It's crazy that the world was that bad. The child had to save the day. Holy shit. Anyways, Link had found out that there was a mysterious mark that appeared on the back of his hand. When Link asks Imp about it, she reveals that Link has been chosen to undertake the quest to find the missing Triforce of Courage, see what I mean there? And awaken the lost Princess Zelda. Not the Princess Zelda from the last game, but the first Zelda, technically. Because many years ago, this Zelda lived in Hyrule with her father and her brother. Although her brother inherited the throne, Zelda knew the secrets of the Triforce. That bothered her brother, so what happened is he had a dubious magician put a spell on Zelda. That spell killed the magician, but put Zelda into a deep sleep. With that being said, the brother learned the error of his ways, and from that point on, that's where we get the name of Zelda for every princess. Yeah, realistically, that's kind of a deeper lore than it really needs to be. All in all, that has nothing to do with the main story. It just explains why Zelda's asleep or why there's a different Zelda, because realistically, the main plot of this game is Impa goes, hey look, to wake her up, you are the chosen one, and you have to get these crystals to the dungeons, and that's really what matters. Also, hey Link, don't die in this process, because if you do, Ganon can take your blood and then revive himself. Some wild archaic shit in this one, right? This game decided to be ambitious on all ends, right? And it doesn't hit the mark because the story like this has never came back, surprisingly. And I feel like Zelda can pull this stuff off now, especially since this feels like something you would hear in like Twilight Princess. This hits more of like a harder core fantasy aspect than Zelda has ever really hit, because all of the stuff feels like it's going into a more fantasy aspect, and I fumbled the story, but like that's pretty much the important things of it, right? With that being said, there is once again revisionist history in the collector's edition where they don't even really mention Zelda the First, which makes this even more confusing. I think the thing that's interesting about the whole multiple Zelda thing is that, yeah, that makes sense that they got rid of it. They don't really explain the multiple Zelda thing in the later games, which I guess makes sense because it's kind of done, but it does make me question who this Zelda is and really what was going on with this idea and narrative point. Anyways, we'll move on, and that was the story. It was ambitious, it was crazy. I enjoy it, but like maybe Zelda needs a remake so that we can see the story actually play out properly. If Nintendo ever wants to take a heavier narrative Zelda game, this might be the one to make a remake of, for the narrative alone, and also the fixing of the gameplay, but that's getting into the gameplay, so let's move on. So when it gets down to the gameplay of The Legend of Zelda 2, they decided to take a dramatically different route from the top-down adventure game that they originally started with. They decided to do something new and kind of focus it more on a platforming kind of game. It definitely does still feel like Zelda, mind you, but it definitely has a dramatic difference for the game itself. This is something that a lot of games did around this era. Castlevania did this, Metal Gear technically did this with Revenge of Snake. Not the same game, but still different, and even Contra did this with stuff like Contra Force. So it's nothing really new that they decided to go with a different kind of gameplay styling. With that being said, the question is it any good? And I actually have no honest clue, because I enjoy this game, but I also hate this game. The gameplay of this game is overly frustrating, right? It feels like it's a product of that era of just difficult to be difficult, or difficult because game rentals are a thing. Because there's a lot of things within this game that could have been just a little bit more simplified, mainly just how the start of the game is rough. The first temple is easy, but getting to the second one, Death Mountain, and all the roundabout ways you have to go throughout this game feels very frustrating. There's a lot of times in this game that I was just absolutely flabbergasted. For instance, there's a time where the game's like, hey, go under a table to find some potion, or hey, there's this thing you can fall down, or even down to some enemies just being overly frustrating. I've had to fight some of the dumbest enemies, and I had to find a way to do these techniques. And the funny thing about the techniques you have to do specifically for enemies like the Iron Knuckle, I would have never learned on my own. I had to learn it from YouTube, actually. When I first initially played this game, I didn't know how to handle them. I just kind of guessed, but it's a crouch stab. That doesn't make sense, right? None of it really makes sense, but this game is just difficult in those places, but I do have some fun with it. Getting yourself a walkthrough and journeying through this mess is ridiculous, and I think that it's ridiculously fun, but god, I could see where people wouldn't like it. I have no clue where to put this in the gameplay department, because there's just a lot that people would be like, no, I'm not interested in, or I don't know, I don't really know where to put this one, but I find it fun. But I think it'd be a lot more fun if it wasn't this way, if it wasn't that difficult, if there was better conveyance. But then again, would the game be the same, right? Would it even be worth it? All I know is that the gameplay itself is frustrating. That's the one thing you can come off from it, I feel. With that being said, let's move on to the presentation. When it gets down to the presentation of this game, I don't really exactly know how to feel. I feel like the sprite work itself is fine, and I'd also rather admit that it's rather impressive for the most part, but I also feel like it does a really good job at embodying Zelda enemies, also having enemies that we haven't seen in forever or a long time within this game alone. And it's interesting because we haven't seen the mace throwers or stuff like the doom knockers in any modern Zelda game, and it's interesting that we haven't seen really anything like this. We've seen creatures close to it, but it'd be really cool for Zelda to come back to some of the enemy designs here as well. The most interesting thing about this game is that there are other people in this Zelda game that aren't just old people. You got your old people too, but it feels like it's interesting because there's cities in this game, and I feel like they convey themselves very well. The map itself is interesting too, but it's a mess, I feel like. I feel like this game was too ambitious for what it was trying to do within its presentation. It's something I should have said in gameplay, but I just didn't. But I feel like all in all, this game's visually was too ambitious, alongside gameplay-wise was too ambitious, because the world is so big. And I think that it conveys itself well, but there's a lot of parts in this game that don't convey themselves very well within, and this is what I'm talking about in presentation, because there's parts in this game where, like, go down a hole. They do not show a hole, right? You just have to wander about, and I don't know, you could have made one of, like, specifically I'm talking about the graveyard level, you could have allowed one of the crosses to look slightly different, or be different colored, which might not have been possible for the time, because you might have been dealing with such limited hardware, but in the end, if that's the case, just put a hole, right? And that's kind of how this game works presentation-wise, is there's a lot of stuff where you're like, okay, sure, you know? I think enemy-wise it's great, I think sprite-wise outside of that is great, but I think with the conveyance of the presentation outside of that, it's okay, right? They could have given you more visual cues, and maybe they couldn't have. I don't exactly know. That's something that I feel like happens more in modern Zelda. For instance, in Zelda A Link to the Past, if there's a bombable area, there's a crack, right? And they kind of kept doing that because they understood that you just can't hide shit. And that is important to the visual identity of the game. And last but not least, the one thing that I forgot to kind of talk about is the music within this game. There's not a lot, but what's there is nice, and I think that it's enjoyable. It presents itself sprite-wise very well, but I feel like conveyance-wise, which is more on the gameplay side, it doesn't do so good. But once again, I do feel like that might be a visual aspect that needs to be talked about. With that being said, none of this matters if you can't get your hands on the game. So let's move on to accessibility. So when it gets right down to it, Zelda 2 exists in the same places as Zelda 1, so it's gonna sound like a very repetitive video. Anyways, with that being said, Zelda 2 came out for the NES, and this game will set you back about $20 to $30. There are some people that are trying to sell it for $70. I would just recommend getting the $20 version of the game. These are also without the box. For the most part, I'm not gonna talk about games in box unless you guys ask for it, but because the idea of it is that you guys are playing it, right? So with that being said, that's the price of it. I'm mainly talking about the gold cartridges because, like the NES one, it's very hard to find a gray cartridge of this one initially. I can't find it. It's probably within the same price range, or it could be more money. I have no clue. I don't even know how many of those were released. Mostly it's the gold cartridges though. With that being said, the Famicom version of this game is only going to set you back about $30 to $40. It's interesting because this one only came out for the Famicom disk system, unlike the original Zelda, so there is no cartridge version to my knowledge. I can only seem to find it, and it will set you back about $30-something, and it's a game that seems to be mainly packaged in with the original one, and you can also get that one for $70 altogether with both. So if you're going to buy a $70 version of this game, just get both 1 and 2. That's kind of where people want it at, and that's fine. With that being said, this game also had a Game Boy Advance release, and that will set you back about $19 to $30-something. That's the US version. This game was also released on the Japanese version, and this one is going to set you back more money than the initial one, going for $80 to $100, and that is without the shipping. This is a very expensive version of the game. I can't tell you exactly why, but hey, these kind of Game Boy ones do go for that much, and I feel like if you have to have a Game Boy version, as much as I love the pretty box, the better price is the US version this time. With that being said, there also is the promotional disc or the Zelda Collector's Edition, which is one that'll set you back about $130 if you want it. Crazy that, once again, this was on the GameCube, but once again, it's an expensive endeavor, and I don't think I can recommend this one unless you're a collector. With that being said, it also came out for the NES Classic, which will set you back about $90 to $70, the Famicom version, which will set you back about $80, and last but not least, it's also on the Game & Watch that came out, which will set you back about $50 to $60. Realistically, all in all, it's pretty much the same prices near the end, and would I recommend playing this game on any of these? Maybe the NES, or the Famicom if you have a working disc system. But all in all, I feel like, once again, like I said before, NSO is the way to go. There is so many other ways to play this version of this game, but I feel like if you're going to play it, especially for the gameplay itself and the frustration that comes with this game, the best way to play this is honestly on NSO. And I know that I've been shilling NSO a lot, but when it comes to classic games, as much as I would just say go get them, there is a scarcity that exists with these because there's only a limited amount of releases. There's going to be a point where these games hit a price that is unreasonable, and either piracy or Nintendo keeping up with something like NSO is going to be necessary. So all in all, I think that the best way to do these are that way. It's really, really cool to have the cartridges. That's the best way to have it if you're like a collector. Or the GameCube version for bragging rights, because this shit's wild. But with that being said, I feel like the best way to do that is that. So without further ado, let's move on to the goods and the bads. So I feel rather conflicted when it comes down to the idea of the goods and the bads for this game, because Zelda 2 is very complicated in its whole existence as a game, because it definitely changes the traditional formula of Zelda, which there really wasn't one at the time. That eventually grew to become a thing in like the later Zelda games. But for this one, them not going with the traditional formula feels like it's an okay route to go. And I feel like for the most part, it feels good. Right? Like the initial gameplay of Link being a side-scroller feels good, but it feels like everything else gets in the way of it. For the most part, I can see what they're trying to do, but the gameplay itself is solid. Link's jump and stab and his upgrades are all great. They make the game feel good. The RPG feeling of the game of leveling up is something that I majorly appreciate. I really enjoy it. I kind of really would like to see another Zelda game like this if they could. It reminds me a lot of like Castlevania 2 more so than anything else, but better performed or better done, because Castlevania 2 has that issue of where they tried to Symphony of the Night it at a time where it's not as easy to do because the NES isn't like really that good of a console of conveying things like something like Castlevania Symphony of the Night does, where Zelda decided to forgo that and chose a map. I don't know when those two games came out, but it's interesting that they're very similar. Castlevania 2 and Zelda, that is. And I think that that's really it. The idea of this game is super fun, and the initial concept of the game is fun. The way it feels, for the most part, outside of, like, the enemies are fun, and that's where it feels weird, is because I have to, like, cherry pick so much. Even the idea of having NPCs is fun. This is the first time that Zelda had more than just your old people, right? And your occasional moblin in the walls, right? So, like, I don't know, this was a really cool concept, but I don't know exactly if it falls flat or not because of how much of the gameplay kind of fights against you and how much the lack of conveyance is there. So with that being said, let's move on to the bad. This is a very ambitious game that I feel could work, but I don't exactly know if it could or not because I'm not a game designer, right? I feel like I really want to say a lot more positive about this game, but I have to come at it from somebody that like isn't me and isn't a hardcore Zelda fan, because I feel like the first dungeon is where most people would stop, because realistically asks you to fight the controls a lot of the time throughout the game, and also the conveyance of the game itself is poor, right? You've probably heard me say that throughout this whole episode, is that there's a lot of times in this game where it's like, I don't really know where to go, or, oh, you have to do that stupid thing, or fighting enemies is hard, right? Those are the biggest issue. I understand where they're trying to go with fighting enemies, especially stuff like the Dark Knuckles and so on and so forth, where they kind of want to convey the idea of a sword struggle, but it doesn't work out that way, especially since the sword struggle kind of just doesn't feel good for the most part. It feels so bad that I've had to learn a new technique on how to deal with them, which is a jump crouch slash, which kind of defeats the purpose of a sword struggle because there's no way in hell somebody's crouching and slashing somebody in real life, right? There's no way that that should be considered as part of it. And I mean, it is cool that there's a tactic for it, but it defeats the purpose because it's not what the creators intended, to my knowledge. I think they wanted a sword fight, which is why they strike high and low. It's meant to be this idea of a struggle, and it is, but it's too much of a struggle, so much so that you have to cheat. And I'm gonna be transparent with you guys, kind of like Mario 2, I needed to rewind a lot through this game to get through it because it is so frustratingly annoying of a game. They have very little health for the most part. Eventually this gets remedied by having your power-ups, but some of the power-ups you get should have just been given to you at the beginning. Like the downward slash would have been amazing throughout this whole game, and realistically so would of having the choice of getting the life power-up. And I like this idea of magic, but it really just doesn't feel fun to me, right? Like, there's been a lot of times where I need to use the shield one, and I'm like, oh, yeah, I have to use shield, right? Like, you don't have to. It could be somebody that's skilled that doesn't need it, but I'm not one of those people. I like the bosses of this game, but to get through the dungeons is very annoying, and I think that it was just a game that was way too ahead of its time. It kind of exists in that, like, Metroid 1 space of where it's super, super cool, but kind of difficult, right? In it's more or less of its execution. And I would have loved it if this game got a Zero Mission style remake. That would have been really cool back in the day, and it's still something that's possible today. I don't know how many people would be down for it, but I think that, like Zero Mission, I think that it'd be really cool to see Zelda 2 get somewhat of a remake. With that being said though, it's hard for me to even really recommend this game, because I have to recommend it on NSO, and I don't know how many people feel about NSO. Or I'd have to recommend it through emulation because of just how difficult this game is, but not by the idea of gameplay, but by idea of gameplay decisions, which may sound weird, but when you play it, you'll understand what I'm trying to say. With that being said, I still love this game. So let's move on to the final thoughts. So, is Zelda 2 worth playing today? I don't know. There's a problem with this game, because I don't know where to stand on this one. I love this game. I really do. It's unique, it's interesting, but also I don't see why you would play it today. It's interesting, but it's also tough. It's also stupid, but it still plays well to a degree. I don't know exactly how to answer this one. I guess if you're gonna play it initially on the cartridge, no, but giving it a try through emulation or, you know, NSO, maybe that might be the way to go, because you have save states and, you know, it helps soften the blow of the game. I'm saying this now because I'm talking about the NSO version of this game. That's how I played it for this video. But back when I played it initially, there was a point where I just couldn't. And that's why I'm having a hard time. In the modern day, yeah, sure, it's worth it. But if you're playing it on the cartridge, I don't exactly know how to answer it. You may enjoy this game, and that is fair. But it is such a far cry from the original Zelda game that it's debatable if it's even worth it to you. I think for the most part you should give it a try, but I won't blame you if you drop it. With that being said, how do you feel about Zelda 2? And that's really all I have to say. I'll see you guys next time here on Nostalgia Goggles when I talk about A Link to the Past. Bye!